Why is my church not to the size that I'd like it to be? So we put Collaborate together a few years ago with that thought in mind. How can we help pastors learn the tools to grow? And so we brought together other pastors who are successful in growth, and they're teaching these pastors how we grow.
Our God is greater, our God is stronger, God, you are higher than any other, our God is healer.
What I love about Collaborate is that it gives us the tools and resources and the insight that we need as pastors, as leaders, to be able to manage the church, to grow the church, to be able to lead the church.
WMCA does this to support the community of pastors and the regional communities each of the pastors serve.
So very happy to be able to meet up with pastors, good men and women who are leaders in New York City, and we really love working with them, talking with them.
So up next, welcome with me, Greg and Steve.
Talk about a little pressure. Brian Batesel, Fernando Cabrera, and I'm up next. You know, one of the things that I think we can all agree on is that churches need to grow organically. You can't rob Peter to pay Paul. You can't say, I'm going to take people from the church down the block, because we're not building the kingdom if we're doing that. Right? We have to grow organically. Then I think about a number that Laura mentioned earlier in the day, that in a city of 8.5 million people, only 5% go to church. That means there are 8 million unchurched people in the city of New York. If they all came to church one Sunday, there wouldn't be enough bagels in the city of New York to feed them after coffee hour, right? So what we're going to talk about today is really an emphasis on reaching the unchurched. I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago with Ron Walters, and speaking to a pastor in Brooklyn. And I always ask pastors, how do you grow your church? And he says, you know what? I have a problem. He pointed to this building complex right outside his office, and he says, I've got 10,000 doors I need to knock on, and I don't know how to knock on them. I don't have the time to knock on them. So today, we're going to show you some of the tools on how to knock on people's doors. Because folks, next slide please, there's a real problem. I mean, it's kind of scary when you look at the fact that 4,000 to 7,000 churches close each year. 4,000 to 7,000. 37% of people attend church regularly, however you define that, and that's a drop from 42%. 47% of Americans have not attended church in 6 months. That's probably, where's Fernando? Probably since Easter, right? 52% of unchurched millennials in the U.S. And finally, we keep repeating this point, 60% of people begin their search for a church online. Let's go on. Well, you know, we talked about, next slide please. We talked about the way it was, knocking on people's doors. And it'd be great because a pastor would walk down the street and go to the diner and say, I'm Pastor Steve, and I'm from this church, and I know you, and I want to invite people to you. And you know what would happen is the church would get filled. I'm oversimplifying it, but my question, next slide, my question is, the way it is now, is how do you knock on thousands of doors in a city like New York? How do you do that? Well, as the Lord said, we've got to cast our nets deeper and wider. It's one of my favorite parts of the Bible. Cast your nets deeper and wider. Next, please. And that means outreach beyond the four walls of your church. Now, connecting with your local church community, because I don't think the boroughs are all that different, quite frankly, that you can walk down, certainly Brooklyn is the borough of churches. So it doesn't take a lot to walk down a few blocks and you'll see another church, and you'll walk down a few blocks and see another church. So how do you connect with your local community around your church? How do you reach the unchurched and those looking for a church? I think that was the message we heard today. That's your low-hanging fruit. And finally, how do you invite them to come to church? Because people will come if they're invited, if they feel wanted. Next, please. So, of course, Christian radio remains the #1 reach vehicle to reach the most people. When you're on WMCA, it's about relevance and it's about influence in the greater church community. And you can do that because you'll be throughout New York City and the suburbs. And I just love this because you've got to think of both these things that we're talking about today, both radio and digital, as mission work in your own backyard. I had a conversation with a pastor several months ago, and he said, so what's the return on investment with radio and digital advertising? And I said, do you do mission work, Pastor? He says, oh, yes, we do. How much do you spend? Oh, about $250,000 a year doing mission work. I said, what's the ROI on that? What's the ROI on the well that you built in Haiti? Do you even know if the people drinking, or do you care if the people drinking from that well are believers or Christians? You're just doing it. You don't measure the ROI. If you want to build a kingdom, if you want to save this city, it all begins with the local church, and radio is a great way to do that. Because look at these numbers. 28% of non-Christian adults listen to Christian radio and WMCA. So that means they're receptive to the message of the gospel. 28%. 90% of the formerly unchurched say a pastor's preaching style is a major factor in choosing a church. So let them hear you on the radio. And 90% of the unchurched say they would come to church if they were invited. So that's a recurring theme. Invite people, invite people. Next, please. This is just a plug for the #1 Christian radio station in New York City, celebrating its 30th year. Christian Teaching Talk is our format. And through that format, our listeners find Christian teachings and sermons, as well as answers to questions relating to their daily life. We have pastors like Dr. Bernard. Thank you. What makes us the #1 Christian radio station in the market is we have lots of pastors like Dr. Bernard every single day from morning to night. And if you're interested in a radio ministry program, this is a little self-serving here. I'll give you my card at the end of the evening. Okay. Thank you. Let's go on. Next slide. Okay, so now we're kind of making a little transition here about the complementary relationship between radio and digital. Let me say this, radio drives search. Radio drives search. It's a great combination. And you can see that radio-driven search by day part. Of course, AM Drive, the most listened to day part, but throughout all the day parts, people listen to radio and then they go and search online. Next, please. And you know what? That's great news because, as Pastor Fernando said before, look at the top 5 ways people find a church. The church website, community events, word of mouth, social media, and location. A lot of churches, and I talk to a lot of pastors, I'm talking about some big churches don't have websites. So as Pastor Fernie said before, website, website, website. Remember those 3 words. Next, please. So, my friends, the pulpit has evolved. Is there anyone in this room who does not have a cell phone? Just raise your hand. I'm not surprised by the answer. By the way, download the WMCA app on your cell phone. 81% of Americans own a smartphone. 67% of us start on one device and continue on to another, whether it's an iPad, whether it's your computer, whatever else you've got out there. So the traditional pulpit was limited to the 4 walls of the church. And as was said before, people walk by your church and they should not say, "What's this?" That means you're limiting yourself to the 4 walls of your church. Instead, the digital pulpit is a church that knows no boundaries. And the 4 walls of the church are no longer a boundary. Next, please. And I love this. Everyone says, "I want to reach millennials. I want to reach millennials." Now, I'm not a millennial by a long shot. Haven't been one for a long time, but scores of traditional churches don't utilize the very tools, the very instruments without which few millennials would know how to communicate or interact. If you are not speaking their language with the tools they use, then why would they know about your church? Make sense? Next, please. So to be successful, 3 things are important. Deliver the right message to the right audience at the right time. Deliver the right message to the right audience at the right time. Next, please. So use the digital pulpit. The digital pulpit can help grow your church by increasing awareness and visits to your website. That's a very local thing. I like to say that churching is a very retail kind of work. The diner owner, the neighbor, people within the close proximity of the church need to know who you are and what you are. So we're going to talk about this today. We can deliver your message. You can deliver your message directly to cell phones, tablets, and computers, both to existing church members and to those looking for a church in your vicinity. 63% of brands, and Pastor Fernando said, a church is a brand. Doesn't matter about the denomination, but you're a brand. Saw an increase in awareness using digital display ads. And there was a 300% increase in site visitation after running a display campaign. Those are impressive numbers. I mean, it's not 1 or 2%. It's 63% and 300%. And we're going to show you today, you may be doing some of this, you probably are, but we're going to show you a better way to maximize that investment. Next, please. So my colleague Greg Cooper is going to take that graphic and try to make sense of it for you. Because he's younger than me. And he understands this stuff better than me. But how do you use these tools most effectively to attract unchurched folks to your church? Greg?
Thank you very much, Steve. I think that you've done an excellent job of kind of helping us to connect the dots between ministry and marketing. And I'm sure that today's been there's a lot of information going on. I want to thank you all very much for your patience. But what we want to do is try to do something I think God is very good at doing, is when you leave here, ask yourself a question. Ezekiel 37:1, God asked Ezekiel a question. He said, "Son of man, can these bones live?" I think the question that we want every one of you to ask yourselves as you are leaving here today is very simple. Is my church in danger of becoming invisible? Is my church in danger of becoming invisible. And if you are not taking advantage of these things and the digital landscape, then your church is in danger of becoming invisible. So we want to show you some very simple ways that you can begin to help make your church more visible to the people right here in your local community. So thanks, Steve, for getting us started. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Cabrera so eloquently put it, it all starts with a great website. If your church doesn't have a website by now, please, please, please make sure that you stop by the surround table, get a card. We can help you do that. A great website is simple. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be mobile compatible. How many of you know that these days, about 70 to 80% of internet traffic occurs on a mobile device? Most of us don't sit in front of a laptop or desktop anymore. We have one of these in our hands. So if you have a website that was built 20 or 30 years ago and maybe your uncle or a friend built it and it's not compatible with one of these devices, if someone goes to your website on their device and it's not compatible, you have just lost a potential visitor to your church. Okay? So make sure your website is easy loading, it is easy navigation. We can help you with that. Don't leave here today. If your church doesn't have a website, it's like your house not having a living room. There's nowhere for anybody to go. Next slide, please. So let's start with that. So let's talk a little bit more about what we're kind of getting you into today in this digital advertising. Think of the internet as the ecosystem, okay? And everywhere you go on the internet, all of us have done it, you'll see along the internet, along those pages that you're browsing, banner ads and space for advertisement. The very, very wonderful thing that you now have access to, even though all of the internet isn't a great place and a safe place, is those places are now accessible for you to share your message with the people right in your local community. Okay? So you now have access to that ecosphere. Now, many of you are in love with, and Dr. Cabrera again eloquently put it, Facebook and social media are wonderful. If you have someone in your church doing your social media, your uncle or a friend or a cousin, you're thinking, okay, the way to the future is let's be on social media. The question to ask yourself is your social media effective? Is it working? Is it getting the job done? We can show you some ways to more effectively utilize social media to make sure that your congregation starts to grow. Of course, social media can give you storytelling capabilities. It can help you to target people when they're relaxed. It allows you to build a following, and you could take advantage of a lot of different tools, but your Facebook and your Instagram have to be optimized, and we can show you how to do that. So what do? We have the ability to now, and here's the secret sauce, you now have the ability to literally target people right around your area when they're using social media, and we'll show you how to do that. How do we do that? Next slide, please. We use something called behavioral targeting. So every one of us has what the internet refers to as behaviors. We go online and we use these phones and we search for certain things and we do certain things. Based upon those behaviors, we can chase you around on the internet. So if someone goes online today and you have a ministry in Brooklyn and someone types in new church in Brooklyn or church near me, we now have the ability to capture that individual's device based upon their behavior, and then later on, when that person is on the internet at CNN, at Fox, at ESPN, or on their social media, we can show them banner ads that can direct them to your church. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, awesome. So it's called behavioral targeting. So based upon your behavior, and it's happening to every one of us right now, right? If you go online right now and you search for Nike shoes and you visit Nike.com or Adidas.com, when you go to ESPN or you go to CNN later, what are you going to start seeing? Banner ads for those shoes. It's the same thing. You, for ministry, now have access to those kinds of tools. Next slide, please. Retargeting. This has happened to every one of us as well. So let's assume that we've built this beautiful website that you have for your church, right? Does anyone know what a bounce rate is? It's very simple. Most of the people, 70 to 80% of the people who come to your website leave within 30 seconds. It's called a bounce rate. But now, if someone comes to your website, you see that first box up there, they visit your website, and let's assume they leave very quickly. They go to another website, because we all have a tendency to browse the internet, and they visit that website, we can now use that banner space, that ecosphere, to show them banner ads for your website to get them to re-engage with your ministry. It's called retargeting. Does that make sense? Excellent. It's happened to all of us. So again, now you're taking tools that are already being used upon you in the traditional general marketplace, and we can now use those tools to effectively help you grow your ministry and have people engage with your church. Next slide, please. Pay-per-click. This has happened as well. Everyone goes to Google and you type in, I want pasta sauce. And the first 3 positions that show up on Google are advertisements, right? It's because those sauce companies have paid to be there. Now, if you're a church, you have to be careful with your budget, so perhaps not the most effective way, but again, a very efficient tool that you can use if your website, like Dr. Cabrera's, doesn't necessarily show up on the first page of Google. You can use pay-per-click to get your church to show up on the first page of Google for whatever search should happen to come up. So if your website hasn't been fully developed and someone types in church in Brooklyn and you're not on the first page, we can actually pay to get you on the first page. Does that make sense? Excellent. Next slide, please. Video advertising. Every one of us knows that the #1 search engine in the world is Google, right? Do you know what the #2 search engine is? YouTube. Video is huge. People need a visual representation. So one of the tools that we can use to help people engage more with your ministry is video advertising. We can use that same ecosphere. If you go to CNN or ESPN and you want to watch a video of content on that website, before you watch that video, what are you forced to watch? A pre-roll video or some type of advertisement. What if that pre-roll video or advertisement was a video of you inviting people in your local community to come to worship with you, right, or inviting people to come to your vacation Bible school or your marriage conference? That visual representation and being able to see you makes a difference. I think it's a statistic somewhere around 90% of people choose a church based on the pastor's preaching style, right? Many people don't come to church because of church. They come to church because of who's there, right? So video can be an excellent tool to help people to engage with the ministry. Next slide, please. Targeted email. Targeted email is basically like someone inviting you into their living room, okay? We have access to, I think the last statistic I saw was about 140 million targeted email addresses of people who have said, you have permission to send us information. So if your church isn't taking advantage of this tool, that's something we can absolutely use. We can target people based upon their age, their demographics, where they're located, and we can get your message directly into their inboxes. Next slide, please. Geofencing. This has happened to all of us as well. We can actually physically, based upon GPS coordinates, we can literally serve advertisements based upon geographically where people live, because every one of these devices has an IP address that gives its location. So that leads us to a very, very important tool that I think is something you all want to take a look at before we leave. Next slide, please. So you can target your local area and get in front of people in a specific geographic area. I want you to picture your church and picture, about a 5 or 10 mile radius around your church. Very, very important, and I think this can be useful for all of us. Next slide, please. So here's a zip code, right? Let's assume your church is in zip code 11207, and you want to get out and announce to every person in that zip code that next week our church is giving away food for Thanksgiving. You want everybody to know because you want to serve that local community. Well, it's very difficult to get out and knock on every one of those doors, but what if, based upon geo-targeting, you could send messages to all of the people that have cell phones, tablets, and computers that are in that zip code? Now you can do that. So door knocking has gone away. We can't knock on their doors, but we can knock on their cell phones, okay? And we can specifically target any of those individuals based upon their zip code and where they live so that we can now surround the local area of your church. Next slide, please. We do all of the creative for you. You don't have to have someone in your church who knows how to create banner ads and to do all that fancy stuff. Got you covered. We handled all of that for you. Next slide, please. Now, Here, I think, is an important part of this message. So what happens after we've used that ecosphere and people see those banner ads? Where do they go? What are they seeing? This is an opportunity for you to customize your message. You can invite the unchurched and those who are looking for a church. After they click that banner ad, you can let them hear an audio message that inspires or evangelizes. What if you wanted to give that word that Pastor Cabrera was talking about? So they click that banner ad, and they can hear you give a word for the day, financial advice, family advice, teaching about a scripture. What if you could record a video message? Once someone clicks that banner ad, they see a video message from you inviting them to come to worship, inviting them to come to your vacation Bible school, inviting them to come to your marriage retreat. And you can also keep your local community updated with special events and services. So again, it's important for engagement that we don't just send them directly to your website where they browse around and they leave. We send them directly to a message that helps them to engage with your local ministry. Next slide, please. So here's how it works. It's as simple as one of these, okay? So how does this work? How do you get that audio and video done? You don't need a professional studio. CCC has got it down to a science, but you don't need all of that. You could literally record your message, video or audio, on your cell phone. You send that message to us. By the way, if you want to, you can come to our studios. Great way to engage with us, okay? Record that message. You send that to us. We then upload it, okay? We then deliver your church's banner ads around that local community, right? We pick the zip code. We deliver banner ads to people in your local community. And then number 3, when those people see those banner ads, they click them, and then they are then able to access that video or audio message that you recorded, and then they have the ability to engage with your ministry.
Great.
Okay? So that's basically how it works. And I think, next slide, I think that just about wraps it up. So, we're good. Steve?
All right, wrapping up. If you're interested in learning more about your church's digital footprint, we can run a free, I know pastors love that word, free audit of your digital presence.
We want to grow the church. It's important for us to see the church grow, and we look excited to hear some of the speakers who are here today and to get some insight into taking our church, our ministry. We've been in Queens, New York for 20 years, and we want to take the church to the other level. We're also thinking about some church planting, so it's all about growth.
Awesome in power. Here we go. I see you out there. Some of you know it, and I invite you to sing along.